Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business and Innovation Q&A. I said I would talk about things that I might know about business, doing, and innovation. So we had a bunch of questions left over from last time. There was a question from Tom here that was, I think, particularly topical last time we did this about the GameStop saga. And well, I might make a few comments about that. I mean, I suppose I can comment on, we're talking about business and innovation and so on. And at any given time, there's always what are the smartest business people going into? And, one feature of doing business is, there are different motivations for doing business. One motivation is you want to make as much money as possible. Another motivation might be you want to create things that are as much value for the world. Another thing is you might want to do things that you yourself find the most interesting and so on. There are a bunch of different motivations, particularly motivations that are sort of make the most money. The closer you are to the money, the easier it is to make money typically. I'm always interested that people who are involved in sort of the brokering of money, the transferring of money, all these kinds of things, you just take your, small percentage and you are sort of, it's a way, money is the story, so to speak. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the finance, sort of the world of sort of financial innovation, which is usually, hedge fund is the generic term used usually. I suppose it's the, day traders on the amateur side, hedge funds on the professional side. And that's, in a sense, the GameStop thing is a competition between those two. But it's sort of interesting to see, who are the people who've been doing sort of the financial innovation at any given time? Who are the people who are doing sort of the leading edge trading and all those sorts of things? And in the past, up until probably sometime in the 1980s, I think the predominant thing was it was people with a random distribution of educations who would become, traders in the, Chicago, the commodities exchange or whatever else. So they would be, they'd be floor traders. They'd be, spend their days. I remember once visiting with one of my kids, actually, a long time ago, once visiting the Chicago, what is it? Commodities exchange. What's it called? But in any case, it's just such a strange thing to see these people in suits. They're in some pit trading something. They're dead still, and then something you can't tell happens, and all these people are jumping up and down and waving around and making hand signals and so on. Of course, that's all gone away. It's all electronic now. But the question was, what was necessary to be successful in that kind of business. And it was interesting because it was an area where there's just a complete spectrum of different backgrounds, from people who had very fancy educations to people who, bailed out of education very early. It was just a particular turn of mind that that let people be successful in that area. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of some of the early cryptocurrency world of again, although that had a different kind of a different piece that was necessary for people to be involved in it, which was a certain degree of technical sophistication. But although in some parts at least. But then sort of what happened in the 80s was this whole area of quant finance. It was really a consequence of things like the Black-Scholes model and its comparative success, or its at least perceived success in the least sort of academic economics world and so on. And then it started to be the case that, that was a great destination for physicists in particular. Physicists were the number one. I know a bunch of the people who were sort of the early cohort of people who transitioned from being physicists to being quant finance people. And it got very very technical and very kind of sophisticated. Can you figure out, and every different company, and I'm happy to say they pretty much all use at least some amount of our technology, I think. They all have their own kind of sort of secret methodology that's based on, could have been early machine learning, could have been geometric optimization, could have been, classical regression, could have been all kinds of things. Mostly it's like people who work for the Defense Department, it's like you don't really ask questions about what in detail they do because it's deeply secret to each of these companies, and they tend to build out this very separate technology stacks, but they're very technically sophisticated, and it's like it's like mostly hiring PhDs and things like this. And what I think is interesting is, to me, another thing to realize about that business is that I think, a lot of details matter. Like for some of these things, it's like, is that holiday 2 years from now going to land on a Tuesday, or is it going to land on a weekend? That's going to affect the payment of some particular loan that gets paid only on weekdays, or some such other thing. And those things start mattering. And there's a lot of detail, as there is in almost every field, that it's not all just, oh, let me be very clever. It's there's lots of details to follow through on. But I think, one of the things that's an interesting question is to what extent a field like that consumerizes to what level. How sophisticated technically do you have to be successful in one of these things? And what's happened right now is that, or in areas like high frequency trading and some of these other kinds of areas, the level of both technical sophistication, there are three things, I think: technical sophistication, kind of access to data, and ability to execute, and having the amounts of money at a scale where it makes sense to do certain kinds of things. Does it make sense to have your own fiber optic cable? Does it make sense to have your own satellites? There's a scale of money at which that makes sense, and it obviously doesn't make sense below those scales of money. So those are things that kind of give sort of a fundamental advantage to one group over another. But sort of, I think an interesting question is, to what extent is this a thing that more people can enter, and to what extent is it you only enter through these sort of channels that are already very well developed, and where it's sort of everybody going to sort of the fanciest schools and getting the fanciest degrees? I mean, I think that there came a time, sometime in the 1990s, I suppose, when people started getting degrees in financial engineering. It's always interesting when you see a field that goes through from the field doesn't exist to the people who come into the field have to come from outside the field because there's no sort of indigenous training in the field. That's what was happening when physicists were jumping into quantitative finance, to there's indigenous training, and most people in the field are sort of fully certified in the field. So I think that it's always interesting. I mean, in the area of things to do with money is always an area where things are being innovated, whether that's in sort of elaborate derivative instruments that elaborate financial instruments that are the derivative of the weather future of the this of the that, whatever. I mean, I always used to think of it a little bit like biological evolution, that there's an ecosystem out there of there's sort of an environment out there, and you're steadily making these financial instruments that are taking advantage of the environment in this or that different way. I suppose an interesting question is to what extent kind of there should be a kind of a save the environment type principle for those financial instruments, because some of them may wreck the environment, just as can happen in an invasive species or something. It's the same type of thing. So I don't know how to think about that necessarily, but I think that the way that I suppose from one of the things I find interesting, is there are lots of very smart people who go into sort of high-end quantitative finance. It may be a place where the smartest win, probably still is. They're smart people who aren't necessarily coming through the traditional education tracks. And by what does it mean, the smart people thing? Does that mean they have a PhD in astrophysics, or just mean they're able to figure out a bunch of stuff really well, but they don't have that PhD in astrophysics? It's sort of a question of who's going to be the winner in those spaces. And I think that may be something that one may see some changes in. But it's also interesting to see these innovations in. Actually, to say something else about this, back in the early 1990s, I thought about, should I play around and do some kind of hedge fundy type thing? And I was in the middle of working on my big basic science project. And I thought, maybe I should take, a few months off and try and build something, some sort of financial engineering adventure. And I eventually decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not that interested in it. There are some interesting puzzle problem solving problems there, but I don't think that the end result, it's like, yes, I might make more money, but I don't really care. And, it didn't seem, to me personally, it didn't seem like a fulfilling activity. And I think, but anyway, back to a different thing. I mean, in terms of innovation in these kinds of areas, it's always interesting to see, at any given time, there's a cycle of innovation in, for example, raising money for things. It's like, oh, you can, venture capital. Okay, that was a thing, when I started my first company, 1981 or so, venture capital for tech was a fairly new thing. And there were certain sort of ideas about how it worked, and it wasn't as standardized as it is today. And then, later on there was, whether it's crowdfunding or ICOs or each one of these things. And usually these things go through a cycle. At the beginning, it's like nobody really knows what the rules are, and you kind of are making a bunch of stuff up for yourself, and it may be quite difficult to figure out how you do it, because all kinds of things could go wrong that weren't expected, because just it isn't a well understood track. And then eventually it gets to the point where, the late stage is, everybody knows exactly how that works. And there's no kind of particular sizzle to like, this is a new way to, for investors to be able to participate in this or that thing. All right, let's see. There's questions here about what's the most innovative prototype that I've seen that surprised you, that didn't make it to the market or failed, and why? Well, I'll tell you an example, okay? This is one of these like silly, funny stories. So years ago, this must be early 1990s, my wife and I were building out some piece of some house. Yeah, I guess it was, and there's a question of, okay, we're going to have this place, we're going to put a television. Okay, so it's like it really would be convenient if it didn't have to be that deep. So I'm saying, don't worry, a 4-inch deep thing is going to be just fine. They're going to be, there are flat screen televisions that will fit in that space. And my wife is fond of pointing out to me that I think that must have been 1990, maybe 1992 or something. And it's like, well, there weren't flat screen televisions for a very long time. I mean, now, of course, no problem. But that was at least a 25-year, wrong prediction. And why was that? Well, I had seen flat screen televisions. What I didn't know is that if you make a television, every pixel has to work. It's no good having a television where, most pixels work, but there's a pixel that's just dead in the middle of the screen. It turns out the yields in making those televisions, you could make a prototype, but you couldn't make a production model. So that was an example of where it was hard to know. I mean, it was like, yes, of course, they're going to be flat screen televisions. I understand they're LCDs and, OLEDs now, but back then it was LCD displays and you could make them and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it took 20 years or something before it went from sort of, yes, you can make enough to make a demo to you can really make a real thing. But in terms of products, oh my gosh, I mean, the history of, another famous one is fax machines. So there were fax machines back more than 100 years ago. And it just took a really long time for the sort of ambient technology to get to the point where it was possible to make a fax machine. Another one is drones. Drones, between battery technology and the control systems, they just wasn't, the ambient technology hadn't reached the right point to be able to execute that in a good way. And I mean, one sees that, augmented reality, same story. I saw virtual reality stuff in the probably 1989-ish type time frame, maybe 1990. And it's like, and some early augmented reality stuff as well. And it's like, if eventually this will make it, but the ambient technology has to get to the point where it's really doable before it's going to catch on. And I think, I remember when the web was young. Okay, so this is a story against myself as often. I had seen, when I first saw the web, it's like, oh, okay, another thing like that. Because, I'd been using the internet for years, in a variety of forms, the ARPANET and then the internet. And then there were things like Gopher and Wace and so on that were these different ways of kind of accessing, sites on the internet. And, the web comes along, it's like, okay, another one of these. And it's like, I was like, oh, it's another read-only system. When you finally are able to have something where you can read and write, then it's going to be interesting. Well, I got it wrong, because the web, of course, did take off. And it didn't take me too long to realize that was happening. And it was partly because of the idea of GIFs and the idea that you could have images in websites. It wasn't just text. These other systems were mostly text. I really thought at the beginning, I thought there were two things the web really needed. It needed, both readable and writable things on websites, and it needed a micropayment infrastructure, some way in which, people could put wonderful things on the web and get paid for it. The fact that, we finally sort of kind of maybe have, certainly in our cloud, we have, and other people have this too, writable web pages, so to speak. Obviously that has come, although it turned out not to be nearly as important as I thought. Micropayments, not really. Not in a, that really didn't come. And the monetization of the web was something I didn't expect at all to work, which is the whole advertising idea. I remember, when Google was young, and I, knew one of the founders of it because he'd been an intern at our company, it's Sergey Brin. It was like, I can't believe this is actually going to work. I'm not sure they did either. It was like they had a bunch of early business models, and it wasn't clear. You put up this thing, it's a cool idea to have a good search engine, and there were interesting ideas about how to make it really be a good search engine. There have been other search engines before. There was one called Alta Vista, which was came out of the DEC Research Labs. I remember I have to admit, when Alta Vista came up, I was, it's like, okay, how do we make sure our web pages get to be highly visible in this web search system? Well, let me go look up the papers of the people who created this search engine, because that will tell me what the algorithms that they're using are. And that was quite an effective strategy. But the idea that you could fund that whole thing and immensely profitably so with advertising was something I was surprised, and I find it, to me, the concept that your customers aren't your customers is something that always disturbs me a bit. I think that in the businesses I've built, it really is the case that in as much as we can, the customers who are paying us are the people who are getting benefit from the things we're building, rather than, the customers are the people who are browsing on the web, but the users are the people who are browsing on the web. The customers are the advertisers. And there's a tension which of course erupts every so often, but it's to me it's a lot simpler if the users of your thing are the customers of your thing. Okay, let me see. So a question here from Parmenides: what business concerns does the R&D process entail? What's the process of inventing your own algorithms from scratch? How many algorithms in Mathematica were just created in-house by us? Okay, so I can answer the last question first of how much of what we've built in Wolfram language is our own sort of custom algorithms all the way down, and how much is kind of from the literature or from existing libraries or whatever else. What we find, so, we'd love to be able to use what's already been built. It's a lot easier than building it all ourselves. We have a delivery mechanism. We're trying to make this very kind of smooth experience, this very integrated language that drives what we can use and what we cannot use. And so it may be that there's a sort of rough hewn thing that does some elaborate numerical computation thing, and great, that's a component, but then we have to build on top of that component to make it something that fits into our, in a sense, distribution channel, our kind of intellectual distribution channel of having this sort of unified language. And I think if you look at what we do, that the sort of one of the principal things we do with algorithms is that interface between the sort of smooth automated experience for users and whatever the underlying thing might actually be. And sometimes the underlying thing turns out doesn't exist, so we have to build it. But quite often the underlying sort of raw nugget of algorithm already does exist. And what we're mostly doing is building automation on top of that to say, well, there are 300 ways you could solve this equation. Let's make automation that maybe itself very sophisticated, that picks for your particular equation which of those underlying nuggets of algorithmic work are we actually going to use. Now, I mean, there's a question of, what do you build? When do you bother to do that sort of deep dive of building it yourself? And when you just say the world isn't ready for this yet, it isn't going to work. And that's a complicated judgment call. I mean, we've been doing all kinds of stuff with machine learning for natural language understanding, okay, which fundamentally doesn't really work that well yet. And you can there are particular use cases in machine learning and natural language processing, but natural language understanding, it really doesn't work that well yet, and it may never work that well. And for us, it's partly like these are tires we need to kick, because if it does work, we sure want to use it. If it doesn't work, well, so be it. But there's a question of how deep do you drill there? How hard do you try, and how much do you say, well, it's just not working yet? Maybe in 5 years something will have been invented that will make it work better. I think for me, it's this question of sort of what R&D is worth trying to do, and what is kind of unrealistic to get to work right now. There's also things to do with what ambient technology should you bet on. I mean, a famous example in our company is the whole virtual reality, augmented reality business, where a couple of years ago, I was again pushing our user experience and user interface people. Yes, we should support virtual reality. And they're like, because we have long-term people at our company, some of them were saying, you told us that back in 1991 and it was a total bust back then. Why is it going to be any different now? And so, there's a question of, do you want to make an investment in this kind of newfangled piece of technology or not? I mean, I was always interested watching Steve Jobs do what he did at Next and Apple and so on. He would occasionally decide there's this new piece of technology. It's a little bit of a stretch, optical discs, whatever else. It's like, is one going to bet on that or not? And, sometimes if you bet on it too early, you can get really messed up because, it just doesn't work. And, if we, or it's something where, you do it, but it's just way, way too slow if you're doing software or something. Or it can be like at what point do you, where in the cycle do you sort of get involved? For us, for example, blockchain and cryptocurrency is a good example. It's like, certainly I knew about those things from when they were first being talked about. And it's like, when should we get involved with this? When has it got to the point where it's got enough, where it's to the point where it's pretty clear that there's actually some meaningful thing to do here and it's not all just going to go away. And another point is, sometimes when you adopt a new technology, it's like, what was it? A recent thing we were doing, we were going to use some database related technology for something that was and it was like, yeah, we should use this. And it's like, well, we're not sure. It was some open source project. And well, guess what? We didn't use it. And thank goodness we didn't use it, because a year later it went off, or 2 years later, it went off in a completely different direction. And it would have completely not been, developed in the direction that made sense for our particular use case. So, I mean, picking technology one's going to base things on is a tricky business. I mean, I like to think that the technology we built with Wolfram language is a good bet, because among other things, we've been able to maintain compatibility of the language for 33 years, which I think is not bad. I routinely use things that I wrote, pieces of code that I wrote 30 years ago, and they still work. And that's a really good sign. But, these are always challenging issues. let's see. Boy, there's a question, a more general question from Pranjul about why does wealth inequality exist? Is it necessary for a society to work well? Boy, those are complicated questions. It's like, you know, how much inflation is right to push sort of push an economy forward? You know, if it's zero, well, maybe nobody does anything. And if it's too much, then everything goes crazy. And, you know, how much is the right amount? I think people debate that a lot. And I think the whole question of you know, sort of, I don't know, the sort of socio-political economic questions. I do think from time to time about these things. I even recently have been thinking about some things to do with sort of foundations of economics. I think some of these things are, well, it depends what you want the world to be like. You know, I think it is a shame right now. You know, one of the things which I find, I suppose, personally frustrating is, particularly in the US, you know, the increasingly large gap between, I would say, what is sometimes the techno elite type crowd and the rest of the country and so on. And I continually, I mean, personally, I'm just there just has to be so much talent and so much opportunity, but it's an increasingly wide gap. And I can tell that because we do a whole bunch of educational kinds of things, and I'm always trying to recruit sort of students from the non-techno elite, you know, part of society, and it is remarkably difficult to do that. And I've had remarkably, frankly, little success in doing it. And it's kind of a sign to me of sort of the separation, which I think is a bad thing. But you know, that's, I suppose, just my preferences about society or something. But you know, I think it's you know, on the other hand, I certainly remember visiting the Soviet Union back in the early 80s, and hearing about the fact, you know, nothing works here. You know, nobody's motivated to do anything. So, you know, there are these different systems have all kinds of different issues. But I think that as I say, I find it you know, there's a question of, even if you want to kind of reach other, you know, outside of the sort of techno elite sphere, it's, in my experience, surprisingly difficult to do that. And I think that's, and you also have to be asking questions like, you know, what are the motivations of different people in terms of, you know, if you, you know, I see it as being a little bit, like, you know, if you go visit some place in the world where people are doing what they do, and it's very different from what one does in the kind of, you know, in the tech world or something like this, you know, are you trying to tell somebody, you know, your way of life is worse than my way of life as a, you know, as a tech CEO or something? It's not obvious. You know, you may think hopefully you think your way of life as a tech CEO is better than their way of life as whatever they're doing in a, you know, nomadic, you know, whatever it is. But I don't think it's not a clear thing to say, you know, fundamentally this is better than that. And I think it's always a tricky thing. You know, my feeling about it from a sort of personal ethics point of view is you know, if you show people options and they say, I'm not interested in that, you know, that's good, but showing them options is a good thing. But figuring out how hard you communicate those options, that's a challenge. I mean, it reminds me of you know, one of my activities, which is kind of advising CEOs of companies. And I'm even reminded of a recent case where it's like, you know, I'm really quite certain that particular company in question should be doing a particular thing, but the CEO of that company just doesn't really want to do it. I think it's a mistake. But how hard do you push? It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's kind of like you're showing this is what you should be doing. I can tell you a zillion reasons why this is what you should be doing. You know, I'm pretty certain from my experience this is what you should be doing. And by the way, I've had the experience a whole bunch of times where I've advised CEOs and I've said, you really, really should be doing this. And they don't do it for one reason or another, usually internal reasons. Usually their own, partly psychology and partly just, it's easy to give advice. It's hard to execute sometimes on that advice. But they don't do it. And then they come back to me a year or two later and they say, you know, that was a really good thing you suggested. I wish I'd done it. And then they say, I wish you'd pushed a bit harder. And the question is, how hard should you push? So that's a challenging thing that I don't think I know the answer to, really. Question here. Questions here about, from Atori, how important is a PhD in doing research in industry? Look, I mean, it depends a lot on the details. I mean, it depends on whether, so there are particular places where the specific knowledge that you get in doing a PhD is going to be important. And there are places where the getting of a PhD is mostly an exercise in, can you do a big project and get it finished? And you know, that's, I would say that in the case of specific expertise, you know, well, then you're going to need the PhD because you need the equivalent amount of expertise that could have been got by going to work in some company or some other place where, you know, you spent several years learning about some particular field. Whether you do that in the context of getting the, you know, the official sort of crested PhD, I don't think that matters very much, but you're going to need a sort of a tower of, you know, many of multiple years of experience in some particular area. And in some areas that is best packaged as, you know, getting a PhD type of thing. In terms of sort of general R&D, in you know, in my company, for example, I haven't looked recently, but I did this survey years ago of what the degree backgrounds of people who are in our R&D organization are. And at that time, it was sort of a uniform PhD, master's degree, bachelor's degree, and a few kind of didn't finish college folk. And it was sort of a whole distribution across these. It wasn't like our advanced R&D. In fact, I think our advanced R&D at that time was more weighted towards people who had less formal educational qualifications. Actually, part of the reason for that was in our particular case, that was, you know, sometimes when people go and they get a PhD, they end up being in this very, very specific, narrow area where they've got a huge tower of knowledge, but it's very narrow. And often what's most important in sort of the high innovation phase of a research effort is broad thinking, not all concentrated in one sort of narrow tube, so to speak. And sometimes even that narrowing, even the PhD can even be a negative, because it's like you're too embedded in kind of the academic way of thinking. We're going to be very narrow. We're going to make things which we can write papers about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are places where it might even be a negative. I think that you know, in the R&D departments of big companies, sometimes it's kind of like, well, the HR department just says we only take PhDs. I think that's comparatively rare. I think they're foolish to be thinking that way. So I would say that the answer is, it's, you know, unless there's specific knowledge that requires that sort of vertical tower of learning, I would say I wouldn't have said that it was a terribly important thing. And I think you know, the ability to finish projects, and in terms of, you know, people who are hiring, at least correctly for this, it's like, can you finish a project? Can you do a project in an environment similar to the environment in which you're going to be in whatever company it is? And for example, if it's a situation where everybody's doing a bunch of projects where they're sort of somewhat individual projects, then the question is, can you take an individual project and do it? In a case where it's very, very, very team-based and has to be because you're building some, you know, giant device where everybody sort of has to pitch in together, then it's a slightly different thing. But I think that you know, to be able to say, look, I've done these projects, I've got these independent projects I've built, that's an important thing, probably more so than I've done this PhD in a structured environment. I've been able to produce this structured thing. Better in this unstructured environment, look at this amazing project I've been able to do. At least that would be my point of view. Let's see. Okay, question from Slayer. How do you know if there's a viable revenue stream for your product? Okay, reasonable question. Common sense is a very good start. Selling products where I think, the first question is, imagine you have the product. How do you actually sell it? Like, let's say you have this thing and it's relevant to everybody who has a kid between the ages of 10 and 15. Okay, how are you going to reach those people? That's a huge number of people, but it's relevant, well, potentially relevant. It's relevant to 1 in 1,000 people who has a kid between the age of 10 and 15. Right? It's very hard to reach that group. You could say, well, I'm going to do a Super Bowl ad. Well, that's extremely expensive, and you have to really know you're going to make back. You're going to get millions and millions of dollars in sales from that. It's not going to, it's not a realistic thing. Otherwise, it's not clear how you reach those people. If you say my thing is relevant to people who are doing, inspections on nuclear reactors or something, it's kind of like, well, you kind of know who those people are. There's a certain number of nuclear reactors. You can kind of go identify who each of those people is, and you say, I know how to reach those people. Now the question is, do they want my product? There may be all kinds of reasons they may not want your product. Let's say that there are, they have to have regulatory compliance of this, that, and the other. And in order to get that, you have to go through this and this and this. And without that, nobody's going to care. Those are some kinds of questions. I mean, I think that in, sometimes people think a lot in terms of sort of the competitive space. I tend not to. I mean, I tend to be like, can I make something which is unique and different and interesting? Other people sort of more triangulate of, well, we got this competitor here, can we navigate that to be able to get to something which is different enough that that people will be interested in it? Clearly, if there are nearby competitors, you need to look at, how do they reach the market? And, for example, if you say, we're going to make this amazing thing, it's going to take over the market for such and such, it's going to take over the market for, calculators for something or other. Then, the market for, let's say, web calculators for this, that, or the other thing. You say, well, how big is that market? Let's figure out. Even if we took it over, is it actually worth anything? Now, sometimes it may be, well, the market right now is crummy because the product is crummy. And, if we did it, we could make 50 times more revenue because then people would actually want this thing, which they don't want right now. But those are other good things to think about. I mean, it's like, well, we're going to make a slightly better mousetrap here, but the existing mousetrap is making far too little money. That's not an encouraging way to operate. I think, so it's really important sometimes. And I'm always amazed at the extent to which people don't apply common sense in thinking about sort of business questions. And, it's a thing where, I think in, an MBA school, people learn a certain set of sort of approaches. I think one of the things, despite best efforts, when things are really new in the world, that's not something you're going to be able to learn in school. I mean, when things are, when there's a sort of a new approach to things, it's like you're kind of on your own and you have to sort of figure it out. But I think, the most important thing in my view is continue to apply common sense. If you have an analytical background, you've done some kind of, sophisticated techie thing and so on, you kind of know enough to be able to do sort of the analysis. Oh, let's look at these companies. Let's find out how many they are. Let's estimate how big they are. Let's estimate this and that and the other and come up with some numbers and so on. You can do that stuff. It's like, well, you might say, oh, no, I don't know how to do it. I never went to MBA school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out it's really common sense, but you have to continue to apply the same analytical thinking that you have in sort of techie areas to that type of thing. It's so let's see. There's a question here from Costa. Do I think my brain worked better when I was 20 or when I was 50? Well, I'm even older than both of those things, obviously, right now. I'm feeling pretty good about the operation of my brain right now. Long may it continue. several things have changed. Okay, I know more. I have a good memory, so that's that helps. You just sort of, the more you learn, the more you know. Another thing is I got better at sort of understanding how to approach problems, and at things like scoping out, what kind of a problem is this? Should I be going in this way or in that way? And that's partly a matter of experience, partly a matter of knowing myself. It's like, is this something, well, for me, often one of the issues is this something I should be doing myself, or is this something I should delegate to somebody else? Because part of being able to do things effectively is, working with other people and being able to know what's the thing where I really need to do that myself, versus, look, there's somebody else who at any age would have been better than me at doing this, and I should just get them to do it. I would say that, when I was 20, I worked with a lot of people who were much older than me, like one particular physicist, well-known physicist, who was when I was about 18, he was about 60. And he always used to complain that, he was 3 times my age, and that was why, he was slow, et cetera, et cetera. He wasn't terribly slow. But I did think at that time, what's it going to be like when it's flipped around and I'm working with people who are much younger than me, which is absolutely what I do all the time. And, I think I do creditably. And it really helps to know a lot of stuff. And it helps to have sort of tried to learn from my patterns of thinking and what I'm able to do successfully, what I'm not able to do successfully, kind of more the how to think about problems. And, I've seen a problem like this before, even if the content is different. I've seen a problem with the same sort of shape as this before. How do I use that? In terms of raw processing, maybe it's just from the inside. I can't really tell. Other than dealing with the 20-something-year-olds who are nice and quick, and that's always a pleasure. I suppose I don't feel unbelievably slow yet relative to them. Long may that continue. Let's see. There's a question from Stephen here. Comment about someone who talks about getting good at the individual skill of making money. Can I say what I've learned about the skill of making money? Boy, I made a decent amount of money. I would say that for me, it's like I have never really concentrated on making money as such. For me, it's do things that I think are good things to do, and don't kind of be stupid about how you make money from doing those things. There are ways to not make money, so to speak. I mean, there are things where you say, I'm going to do all this stuff, and there isn't really a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm going to do all this stuff, but even if I did all of this and it worked out really well, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no money to be made here. The other thing that is a real killer for making money is you do a project and you get this whole machine ramped up to do the project. Then the project is basically finished. You've spent the money, you've got the project, you built a product, it's out in the market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the engine is running. And you keep running that engine, and you keep running the engine, and it keeps on spending money. And by that point, that money is all wasted because you already made the thing. You don't need to keep running that engine. I mean, you need to continue developing it. That's a common thing. But there's in my experience, the place where you fail to make money is when you've developed something and you stop paying attention to it, and it keeps on spending money. And you don't, when you're really paying attention, it's much easier to have it make money. When you're not paying attention, that's when it spends money but doesn't make money. At least that's been my experience. And that's a place to watch. And I've sometimes not done a very good job of that, when a thing is not in its kind of energetic phase, how do you make sure that it is either continually energized or at least not spending too much money? And in terms of I suppose that there are sort of being able to, when it comes to making money from, part of making money has to do with, you have to have a structure in which to do it. I mean, like, you make a product, it's like, how are you going to get the product to the market? How are you, it has to have there has to be some structure around it. It's not just, I had this cool idea, the ideas as such aren't worth that much. What ends up mattering is the whole execution of the idea and how you actually deliver it to the world, so to speak. And if you don't have that delivery mechanism, it's difficult. I mean, occasionally, more than occasionally, I have ideas where it's like, well, this is a really cool idea. You could even make a product out of this. But it's like, I don't have the distribution channel for that product. I have no idea what to do with that. It's not something I can do anything with. I mean, one example for me comes to mind is years ago, as a matter of sort of personal nerdy organization, I thought, I need exercise every day. Let me, if I can't walk outside, I'm going to walk on a treadmill. Okay, if I walk on a treadmill, I want to be doing some work at that time. I want to be able to type. Okay, so I figured out, how do you manage to set things up, as many years ago now, how do I manage to set things up so you can, type on a treadmill? And how do you, arrange the little gel strip in the right place so you're, doing the biomechanics correctly so that you can actually keep your fingers on a keyboard at such and such a number of miles an hour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, all good. So I did it for myself, and it's like, this would be a good product. And it's like, I have no clue how to distribute such a product. I could make a patent. Okay, what the heck am I going to do with that? I could say, well, here's this thing. We mostly make software for this or that. We make websites. Oh, and we also have this thing for making this, treadmill that you can type on. It's like not going to go anywhere. Not an idea that I can do anything with. And so it's like, I'm not going to do anything with this. Let's move on to the next thing. So I think that's you can waste a lot by pursuing things that you just don't have a mechanism to get there. I would say that I'm a bad example in terms of, a lot of times people say, oh, you make a bunch of money and then you invest it and you make more money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've done rather little of that. I mean, I have a pretty simple strategy, which I unfortunately am too lazy usually to execute well, which is whenever I'm using some product and I think this is a good product, it's a good thing. It's like, invest in that company. It's a simple strategy from which I happen to have done very well. Sometimes it's, well, I know the CEO, I believe in the CEO, even though the rest of the world doesn't believe in the CEO. Okay, I should invest in this company. But honestly, I find, I happen to have made a decent amount of money doing those kinds of things, but maybe it's a strange psychology on my part, and maybe a sign that I'm not really a business person after all, is that, I feel a little bit guilty when I make money from just, somebody else's stock price went up. It's like, I didn't do anything for that. I made this decision at some point to invest in this company. That took me 5 minutes to make that decision. And, it feels much more like the right thing if I made some money, it's like because I actually had a good idea myself and I actually executed and I put in a lot of hard work. To me, that feels much more, it feels much more like the right thing than this, I happen to be riding on some surfing some particular wave. But that's probably a comment on my own anti-business oriented psychology or something, and it may not apply to other people. But let's see. There's a question here from what advice can you provide an entrepreneur who has lost their high-tech business of 15 years due to bankruptcy? How can one overcome the emotional baggage of such a loss? The good news is if that's in the US is a place where people expect sort of people to try again. There are countries, I remember, well, in other countries, people are like, oh my gosh, failure is such a terrible, shameful thing that if you fail, you'll never be able to try again. Certainly in the US, that really doesn't seem to be the story. It's like, the stories of the mythology of Silicon Valley is full of failed, amazing success. But I think the challenge always is from a purely personal point of view. I mean, look, I've been lucky enough in my life. I've not had really, I've not experienced kind of the resounding failure type story. So I can't speak too much from personal experience with that. I would say that in terms of what can I suggest? I mean, um, you know, I think one of the things I sometimes see with people is they work very hard at something, and then there's something that they do kind of just for fun, and they don't take it too seriously. And it turns out that thing is incredibly successful. So for myself, back, this is early 1980s, I did particle physics, I did some computation type stuff. I did those as, they were hard work. And then for various reasons, I was like, I want to do something for fun. And so I started working on simple programs like cellular automata and kind of understanding how those worked and so on. And it's like, I'm just doing this for fun. Turned out that was sort of one of the most interesting pieces of science I ever figured out, came out of that activity that I did for fun. And I think people sometimes have the point of view that there's a thing that they should be doing because it's kind of the hard work that they were built to do, and so on and so on and so on. And then there's this other thing over here, which it's like, well, it'd be kind of fun to do that. And it's like, well, just do something that's fun. Because, among other things, what can happen is that the amount of sort of emotional energy that you put into something that's just kind of fun, even though you don't know, this isn't going to be a thing that's of dramatic, profound, immediately obvious earth-shattering significance. It's just something you find fun. And it turns out, well, what I found is, the pattern of my life has been that almost everything that starts as a hobby turns into a business. And, it's an interesting question. I've been doing all this live streaming recently. I don't know what that's going to turn into, but, I do it because it's kind of fun. And it's not, and maybe it turns into something, maybe it doesn't. But I think that that's a good way to, if you're like, oh my gosh, I had this, really hard work, it didn't work out so well. It's like, just do something fun. And, if you have if you created a business before, you do something that's fun. It's, turns out if you notice somewhere in doing the thing that's fun, oh yeah, actually there's a business opportunity here. You'll notice that, you'll be able to leverage from that. That's my, that would be my immediate take on that. Okay, there's a question here from Sean. Boy, there are a couple of related questions here, quite interesting ones. From Sean, says, I'm obviously a person who's created a way to dive deeply into a subject. How do you recommend that people keep their focus when it's easy to be distracted? Yeah, well, I think, what could I say about that? I mean, I don't find it too difficult to do that. I think that it is, you have to have kind of to me, being able to have incremental progress on a project is important. And sometimes I just like, I'm not, for me, I'm doing, let's say, a technical project. I'm doing a project with other people. It's like, if it's a technical project, I'm like actually writing, creating notebooks, that are the steps in the project. I'm writing code. Things are happening every day. That's important to me, to keeping focused on the project. If I was just like, well, I'm going to do a little piece here, a little piece there, but being systematic in the things that I'm actually producing is important. And same with working with other people, being systematic, and there's some sort of project management mechanism, there's a weekly meeting, things are happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Allow yourself to be a little bit distracted, pay attention to what's happening in the rest of the world, be curious about it. That's not bad. But so long as you have a thing where okay, this is the structure, I got to this point, now I'm going to get to the next point, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you have that structure, I think it is, at least for me, it's not so difficult to sort of keep going and get it to the end. I mean, look, I would say that, I kind of have noticed that I'm pretty good at actually finishing stuff. And sometimes that goes way out of control. Like there's a project like my big new kind of science book project. That was a project where I thought, a 6-month project, maybe a year project, but I have a definite plan. Took me 10.5 years to finish that project. That's a long time. I mean, I was working at least half of all my time on that project for 10.5 years. It's a huge investment, and arguably too much of an investment. I don't know. I'm pretty happy with what came out, but that was, from a personal point of view, that was serious, tenacity to get through a project like that. And I think that, so for me, I sort of have a principle. I finish projects. And I suppose that I've not, it's funny because as I put more and more things on the web and I've got pretty good archives, I'm putting a bunch of papers that I wrote maybe 40 years ago, which I didn't finish, putting them on the web. And it still bugs me. I didn't finish it. I should have finished it. And like, I'm just working on a project right now that I just discovered that I almost did in 1992, and I almost did it again in 2007. And it's like, by golly, I'm actually going to finish it this time. Not a terribly big project, but I think that there's and also you kind of need to have a good vision in your mind for what it means to have finished the project. Is it, you're creating something, you're writing something, you're releasing a product, what are you doing? You have to kind of be always thinking about what the end is, because sometimes people will do a project, they don't really think, what's the end game going to be? What am I trying to make here? I'm doing some project, it's some research project, whatever else, but I'm doing it and I'm doing this thing over here and that thing over there and that thing over there. But what is the final delivery vehicle? Am I writing a paper? Am I doing, am I writing a blog post? Am I putting out a website? What's the final delivery? And I think that's another way to help one focus on, finishing projects is, what is it I'm trying to fill in? What's the thing I'm trying to actually put together? And as you incrementally are able to do that, it's much easier to see how you get the project finished. And also you get to see for yourself, oh, I filled in 4 out of 5 pieces of what I need to do and so on. So at least that would be my suggestion. But I don't think you should shut down sort of all distractions. I mean, if a distraction means you're going and watching television or looking at your Facebook news feed, yeah, well, I would shut down those distractions. I mean, I think one of the things for me, at least, look, I don't watch any television. I don't look at any Facebook, news feed. Do I get sort of fear of missing out from that? Well, no, I don't actually. Sometimes it's like, well, yeah, I can watch something, I can see something. It's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then I think, well, what's on the other side of that? The time that I might be spending on that, what else could I be doing? And I'm like, I really care about these other things I might be doing. I don't really care about that. It's fun while I'm doing it. It's fun. I watch the thing, whatever. But it's like, and then I'm done. And it's like, I don't know what I have to show for this. It doesn't feel, for me, it doesn't feel very fulfilling. And so for me, it's pretty easy to make the decision. I'm just ignore that stuff. Just don't look at that stuff. And don't get sort of reeled in to looking at it. Okay, this is from RBS saying they rarely finish their projects. Please help me. Business sounds boring. I just want to do innovation and research. I think maybe business could be a consequence of a new innovative idea and successful project. Let's see, of course, I could be a business person in the real world since my projects are my hobby and personally based. This theory, I just explained that sort of things that I do as hobbies end up becoming sort of businesses for me very often. And, I think this theory of I'm going to do this really boring thing as my day job, but I'm going to get, I'm going to have a lot of fun with my hobby. I kind of feel like that's a shame. It's like, can't you be innovative enough to figure out how to turn the thing you really, really like, that's your hobby, into something that's somehow also your day job? Now, it might be just outright impossible, but I think that it's worth putting a fair amount of effort into seeing, could there conceivably be a way to take the stuff you really like and maybe some tweaking of it, some refactoring of it, make that into a thing that you can do as a day job, so to speak. I mean, people, what is, quotes, business about? Depends what sort of aspect of business. If you are, working in an existing business, then you've got your slot. If your slot is something you're interested in, great. If it isn't, then find another slot. If it's a question of you starting the business, well, it's kind of what you make of it. You can start a business where you get, immediately plugged into, you're the person who's selling to all the customers. Okay, if you don't like sales, it's a bad deal. You can be in a situation where you're, different kinds of things. I mean, one of the features of CEOing is you really do get to pick, in the end, you're sort of holding the bag and you have to be able to jump into almost everything. But the things that you choose to emphasize and spend the most of your time on, you get to pick that. Now, the things you pick may or may not be the things, in other words, you can make your company more and less successful by picking those things in a better or worse way. But it's still the case that, in the end, it's sort of your decision what you pick. You can be very technically oriented, you can be very people oriented, you can be very kind of sort of business and distribution oriented, very marketing oriented, and you can pick some of those things and try and delegate the other ones away. You kind of have to understand them or they'll go wrong, at least in my experience. But it's not the case that you say, oh, I'm doing a business, I've got to lick all the stamps, so to speak. It's not true. You can, so long as you understand that process and you can hire somebody to do that, then that's the thing you're not doing. And you're, some people may say, oh, I really want to do this business, but that technical stuff, all that IT stuff and so on, oh my God, that's just horrifying. I can't deal with any of that stuff. And yet somebody else will say, I really love the technical stuff. I really love getting in and, setting up the database system and doing this and that and the other. And, all that stuff where I'm dealing with, the accounting, so, dealing with customers, whatever, I hate that stuff. Well, you can to some extent choose, and also in the structure of the business you build. For example, if you build a sort of consumer on the web business, you might never talk to a customer. Whereas if you build a business that's talking to a small number of, selling to a small number of customers, you'll be talking to customers all the time. So, these things are, you can kind of choose a bit what you do. Now, in terms of sort of innovation and how to do innovation, it's, look, if you are in a well-established field and you are prepared to play the academic game, universities are a good deal. There's also always at any given time, there's a certain set of research labs that exist. It's been a changing set that went from usually a good rule of thumb is whenever companies have some level of monopoly in some area, they can afford to have kind of fairly innovative research lab type operations that will benefit them and that will make sense and so on. But, sometimes you can find a niche, maybe it doesn't last forever, maybe 10 years or something, where, like at one moment, I remember years ago, I remember talking to the person who became CEO actually of a large, let's say, oil instrumentation company. And they were at that time, they were actually the world's most profitable company at that particular moment. And they were like, oh, we really need to, we're going to do basic research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like I gave them some advice about, you should set up some kind of endowment because, when the price of oil goes down, you're not going to want to do this basic research anymore. They didn't do that. They hired a bunch of very fancy researchers. They, there was sort of a downturn. They sort of cut the funding. All those people left. The whole thing evaporated. But that was a sort of typical example. While it was a thing, it was a good deal for somebody who was interested in research and innovation. It was a good environment. It was a good collection of people. And, there are usually these, I would say usually about 10-year, sometimes they've been longer, Bell Labs lasted a lot longer than that. These places where they are fairly sort of often quite well managed, sort of places where a lot of interesting, Xerox PARC, another example, these places where sort of really interesting, a good environment, doesn't have the same kind of academic sort of some of the sometimes parochialism of academia, but it's just like, we're going to do something that's going to be new and exciting, but usually it doesn't last forever, that's a different environment in which to be embedded than the start your own company thing. I mean, the start your own company thing, it's hard work. It's not something, if you're like, I don't really want to work very hard, I wouldn't start a company. It might be, oh, I have this amazing idea. It's all going to be incredibly easy. I don't think it's ever incredibly easy. And if it's easy, you're going to want to go to the next level and it's not going to be easy anymore. So it's, I would say it's not for the, now, having said that, again, I keep on emphasizing they're just very different personalities of people who start companies and are successful with companies. But I would say that sort of tenacity and working hard are fairly, I haven't seen many examples where that isn't the case. Let's see. A question from Jimmy. is the fact that a lot of companies are pre-revenue and some large companies don't even have a viable revenue stream indicate a tech bubble? Oh, good question. I mean, one would think so, but I think that, you know, it's hard to know. People sometimes think that sort of a new way of doing business, sometimes it's like you can be, if you define a new way of doing business, it can be years before you start making money. But if you own that new way of doing business, it's inevitable. And since, things like stock prices are basically, supposedly, in some theory of economics, I don't think it's a very real theory of economics, are a reflection of sort of the expected, the sort of this discounted value of future income streams and so on. I don't think that's actually a real model of stock prices that anybody would believe in at this point. But I think it's much more the internal psychology of bidding things up and so on. But I think that the question of can there be meaningful companies that don't make money for years? I think the answer is yes. That certainly worked in the past, and I'm sure it will work in the future. Now, another interesting question is if you look at something like cryptocurrencies, where there's really no there. I mean, in the sense that, the idea that you're going to buy cups of coffee with Bitcoin is not a real idea. The idea that eventually there will be computational contracts that run the world, that's a real idea, but it has only tenuous connection to cryptocurrency. So a lot of what goes on in cryptocurrency is a story of kind of the internal process of transactions happening and the internal sort of process of speculation, and then sort of, ICOs being done, denominated in one cryptocurrency for a new cryptocurrency, and all these kinds of financial machinations. And I have to say that my opinion about whether that's all sort of bubbled or not has changed a bit. Because, it's a question of your foundational idea about economics. What is economics? What makes value in economics? In the end, we're just, all the economic system of the world is just in the world. There's nothing from the outside, so to speak, that's feeding it. So in some sense, it's all just sort of bubbling around in the world and somehow making some version of value. And I've come to think recently, actually, in a very basic science kind of way, about the analogy between value and this phenomenon I call computational irreducibility. And essentially what it's saying is, whenever there's enough stuff going on and enough different unwindable transactions that happened, then there is a notion of sort of genuine value that is some sort of, it's similar to the notion of heat in thermodynamics, that it's kind of you can't sort of arrange all the molecules. By the time you've changed the motion of molecules into heat, where they're all sort of randomly running around, you can't sort of go in and change that back into, oh, by the way, the molecules are all going to climb to one side of the room and the rest of it is going to be without anything. There's sort of an irreducible sense in which there's this, in which this sort of heat exists in the system. And I think it's somewhat the same kind of thing with value in financial systems, is a recent sort of thinking of mine, which kind of makes me feel more convinced about the fact that there is some sort of unwindable value in some sense in all these transactions that happen inside cryptocurrencies and things like that, which means rather bizarrely that there might be that in some sense there's a notion of value in which it produces in a sense nothing. I mean, after all, in the end, if one's very sort of zoomed out of it, we've got this sort of one closed ecosystem, closed world, and we're not really producing anything outside of that. It's all internal things happening. And you could say, well, and this sort of relates to the philosophy of economics and things, in the end, it relates to sort of making people better off and things like this. But I would say that it's a pretty complicated thing to say. And I would say that I am increasingly convinced that there can be sort of a solid value to something, even if in a sense it seems to have nothing productive happening in the world. Now, what does that mean? I mean, it means that there's a value to activity, so to speak, that doesn't necessarily have to be activity that somehow has some sort of lasting benefit for the world or some such other thing. Now, that doesn't mean that my own philosophy of business and the things I choose to do, I'm much more interested in the lasting value to the world than I am in the sort of process of having financial value. but I'm kind of I'm beginning to think that there's a notion of financial value that can be truly devoid of any sort of long-term, visible betterment of the world, so to speak. I'm not sure that's what that means in terms of one's sort of socio-political point of view. I don't really know. I haven't thought that through properly. But that's so. So I don't know. From a purely financial point of view, it's the question of sort of the disconnected universe, and can it have financial value? I'm beginning to think maybe it can, and so that's not a great answer, but that's my current thinking on this. Question from Sean: how did I deal with issues regarding scaling systems as our company grew? I would say, one important thing about starting companies is, you can be pretty scrappy with a lot of your systems because you don't know what's going to be important and what's not. And as you get beyond certain scales, and there's some government regulations that apply to companies of more than X number of employees and things like that, and that gives you some sense of scale for this. But there's also just the practicality of you don't need the most elaborate vacation tracking system when you have 5 employees. For example, in our company, at the beginning, we had a totally scrappy accounting system that was really quite underpowered. For as the company grew, it became underpowered, but it was okay at the very beginning. And often you trade off people, and sometimes more sophisticated people, doing things. It's like you can have a very well orchestrated, very well oiled system, and then you need people who are less able to kind of think and build systems operating it. Or you can have something where, well, we didn't do it, it's just held together with Scotch tape and so on, and it needs somebody quite sophisticated to have the thing not sort of blow itself apart. But that's okay when the company is still small and you don't need it's not really an industrial thing. Like, let's say onboarding employees. Okay, so by the time you have hundreds of employees and you're hiring new people all the time, you need a process for doing that. But at the point where you have 20 employees, you really don't need that. It's pointless. And you can have the CEO can personally greet and train those first 20 employees. Whereas, by the time you're at 500 employees or more, or 1,000 or whatever, it's like, that's absolutely a stupid idea. You want people who are specialized in, HR, they're going to deal with onboarding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think it's an interesting issue at when do you make those transitions? And I think, if anything, you keep going until it's sort of so obvious what you do in some process that you can say, okay, we can delegate this to somebody who doesn't have the same ability to kind of invent things, on the fly. And I think, you can wait a while to do that. I think that, in terms of servicing customers, you ought to do things where, there's a question of, okay, something breaks, and it's like, do you have the sophisticated R&D person fixing up that thing for the customer, busily fixing it up? Or do you have this whole mechanism with layers of technical support and this and that and the other? It's kind of okay if you're small and it happens only once a month that sophisticated R&D person, is being called in to go fix that thing for the customer. But if it happens, 10 times a day, it's a different story. So I think that's my way of thinking about sort of scaling things up. And I would say, don't overbuild at the beginning. I mean, it's like what people do. It's like a classic of people starting a company. Okay, so the classic, a more sort of cartoon version of this is a group of people says, we're going to start a company. They say it's going to do this, it's going to be great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then they start discussing how they're going to split up the pie for this company. And they get so wound up in splitting up the pie, and they put so much energy into splitting up the pie. It's like, oh, what was that company going to do after all? And it's like, there's no point in splitting that, in understanding that next level until you know the basics of what is the company. So there's no point in building elaborate systems until you know what's going to be important. I mean, I'll give you an example recently, sort of a funny example. In our science project, people were saying, when we brought out this physics project, it's like, what about peer review? It's like, okay, let's build a system for people doing, peer review of our documents and so on. So people in my company are well trained to well, everything we build, it's got to be a system, it's got to work well, it's got to be scalable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, it's going to take us ages to set up this peer review thing. We've got to have this whole data system behind it, and it's got to have all these, mechanisms for approving things and pipelines and workflows and so on. And I said, just don't worry about it. Let's just put up these things. And if anybody actually sends in a review, then by hand, we'll go process it. We'll put it up on the web. I believe in, what is it? It must be 10 months now. I think there's only one review that got put up there. So it would have been a horrible mistake if I'd allowed my team to go and, build all this stuff and spend, a whole week, 2 weeks, whatever, building all this elaborate technology to do it. Doesn't matter. It's like in 10 months, one review. Don't need anything. Much more efficient to have the person who was, I don't know who put it actually put it up. No doubt somebody who is way overqualified put that one review up because it didn't matter. It was, very little work. So I think that's, don't overbuild when you don't know what's actually going to happen. Worst case, somebody's up very busy, up late at night doing things, and it's like, that's the price of success. In the case where things are successful, well, yes, everybody has to be, working very hard and so on, but be happy, because that's, that's a sign of success. And then you start putting in place the more systematic systems, and people can be, don't have to do that anymore. Let's see. Oh boy. Okay, a few more things, and then I need to run off here. So, question from Harry: what's my take on the emerging space industry? That's an interesting question. I think about this from time to time. I know a bunch of people involved in that industry, and it's like, what's the killer app for space going to be? And, it's funny because you say, what's the killer app for computers going to be? Obviously, that was before my time, but it's like, if Alan Turing had tried to imagine what's the killer app for computers, he did get it wrong. What's the killer app for the web? What's the killer app for, each one of these different kinds of things? How do you figure out what it's going to be? But you think back to airplanes. What was the, people wonder what's the killer app for airplanes going to be? Really? Transporting people? Aerial reconnaissance? Dropping bombs, cargo flights, I don't know, tourism, it's well, obviously we know the end of that story. For space, it's interesting because I remember times when people were saying when space was sort of in a low ebb, people were saying, oh, it'll be used for growing perfect crystals in space that will be used in the semiconductor industry or in the drug industry. Maybe. It'll be used for, mining the moon for helium-3. Maybe. I really doubt that one. We'll go capture an asteroid and it'll be full of tantalum, and that will be really, we'll do tantalum mining there. Well, I don't know how much tantalum the world actually needs. Again, sometimes things sometimes if somebody said, we just got, tantalum is now free, okay, what can the world do with that? Maybe something will be invented that's important there. But, I think that it's interesting, even the, satellite imagery, for example, now that's an interesting case, because it's now, there's several companies that are now, taking daily, fairly high resolution satellite imagery of the Earth. What are people going to do with that? Well, there's weird things like, hedge funds can buy some of that to go do, car counting in parking lots or other kinds of things like that. It's the old story back from the time when Galileo licensed his telescope to the merchants of Venice, to go and figure out, you go climb that big tower that still exists in Venice. And, you go look out at the horizon and you see whose ship is coming in. And if you can see, if you can be the first one to see whose ship is coming in, you get to make a trade based on that, and you win. And, it's sort of, the world hasn't really changed a lot since the 1600s in that respect. Now it's, if you can be the first one to see with your satellite imagery to see this thing in the world, then, but that's a very weird sort of reason to fly satellites. And then it's like, okay, cell phone service. Well, a handheld cell phone can't really send signals back to an Earth orbit distance satellite. So you're dealing with base stations, but then you think about 5G, which has base stations all over the place. And so it's a complicated story of technology. I mean, I think a lot of people are betting on the idea of cell phone kinds of things. I mean, it's some people. I mean, there's still some people talking about high altitude drones for that, which I think makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure you need satellites. Maybe satellites are cheaper. I don't know. I think it's sort of a then there are things like weird economic possibilities, like maybe it makes more sense to be doing cloud computing in high altitude drones, which are powered by sunlight and don't need cooling and things like this, or in satellites. I don't really know. Those are details of sort of the economics of the technology that I'm not sure about. And I think that's now, I mean, what's possible now that you can, anybody can put one of these little, nano satellite type things, you can just put your random payload in space. It's always a little, I had a friend who was I would say a little bit of an amateur hour operation in terms of his satellite activities, who had a small satellite and they lost their satellite. And it's like, well, that can happen. And, it's like, but, sort of anybody can put a satellite up, a tiny payload up at this point. And what are you going to do with it? I don't think anybody particularly knows. I mean, I think that, what are the killer apps for space going to be? I think that, I don't know whether, is tourism going to be big? It may depend on details. I mean, if some rocket that's flying a bunch of tourists blows up at the, people may say, I don't know whether I want to really do this. If that doesn't happen, if the first, 300 tourist trips go just hunky-dory, it might be a different story. And, a lot of details can matter in that regard. So I don't know what, I'm very curious. I mean, I think, another thing to say, when I was a kid in the 1960s, the space program was really big. And I was sort of the first thing that got me interested in technology and science and so on was the space program. And it's like, I might have, if you'd asked me, what are you going to be when you're grown up? When I was probably 9 years old, I probably would have said a spacecraft designer. Okay. And, thank goodness I didn't do that, because that business has, it's another, 50 years later, and finally we're at the point where things are really hopping in that area. So, it's complicated. And if you say the thing I really want to do, I certainly knew many people over the course of years who say, I really want to be an astronaut. There's a limited number of slots for that. But maybe going forward, there are about to be tons of slots for that. Whether it will be the kind of whether it will be the thing you think it's going to be. I mean, the astronauts I know, that the thing that's most notable about them is they're knowing enough about a lot of different things and being able to kind of sort of rapidly and effectively switch into different kinds of things and just, get those things done. But I think, in the end, I think the sort of the space program added a lot of glamour to sort of the astronaut business in its early days. And I'm not sure that it's a glamour business particularly. It's no doubt an interesting business, but it's not the rock star business that I think it was at one time supposed to be. But I think it's like, there are probably some really good ideas to have about space, and they're beginning to be accessible. It's beginning to be the case that sort of your average startup can fly something in space. And now the question is just, what are you going to fly and how are you going to make it useful? And interesting questions. Let's see, there's a question from Akash. I'm nearly at the end here, but how do you make somebody fund a company that's just at the idea stage? It's a tough business. I mean, you have to have a really good idea, and you have to have a person for whom it resonates for one reason or another, and it's pretty random. And I think that really, probably the answer is find somebody who has a personal belief in you, either because they've known you for years or some other reason, and that's the most plausible possibility. Because if it's just an idea, unless it's an idea that is sort of so, it's very rare that there's an idea where you tell that idea to somebody and somebody just says, oh my gosh, that idea is so fantastic, I know it's going to take everybody to the moon, so to speak. That's really rare. And the person you tell that to has to be already very primed for that idea. And so you kind of have to have an idea that isn't just like, well, everybody's had that idea. It's all a question of just executing, versus that idea is so far out there that nobody can understand what the heck you're talking about. So you kind of have to be talking to somebody who's primed for that idea if you're going to sell your idea on the basis of the idea itself. And so that kind of makes it, you're selling it on the basis of you. And so, I think that that's the most realistic possibility. You have somebody who's known you for years and they've seen you do all these things and you've done amazing stuff. And they're like, now you have an idea. And the person's going to say, look, I'm going to bet on this person. It's a good bet because this person's been doing, I've seen all the amazing things this person's already done. I think that's kind of the path for that. I think that the raw, let me tell you an idea, as I say, unless you find a person who's incredibly primed for that idea, it's not going to work. Or they're just going to say, well, it's an idea that everybody has, so I don't really care. Let's see. There's a question here from Pakinji. Let's see. I've heard Silicon Valley investors' opinion that the best businesses begin operations in areas in which they're the only ones, but with a horizon of big growth. Do you think math is in this horizon of growth, or is it committed to a limit that, well, I think, at the time when we started doing mathematical computation, when I started doing this 40 years ago, there was there were existing things, but it was a pretty wide open field. I would say at this point, I'd like to think that, the things we've built have kind of made a pretty, pretty big tower in that area. Is it an area that has room for growth? Yes, math as such has room for growth. It's not the main area. I would say that's a tiny fraction of what we as a company concentrate on. It's a good core piece of the business, but it's not the main area of growth or interest. I think that it's wonderful, but it's not the main thing that we're building with Wolfram language and so on. But I would say that it's funny because you'll find. And I have many friends who are Silicon Valley venture capitalists. So but I will say you'll find a venture capitalist who will tell you everything and the reverse. And sometimes it's the same person. So they'll say, you should be the one company that's doing this, to, you don't want to be the one company that's doing this. There has to be a whole gaggle of companies that are doing this. I'll tell you an example of the one company and how that can go bad. So when the iPad was first coming out, some people at my company were, really figuring out how to do interesting, innovative things on the iPad. So we built some very nice stuff. And when the iPad came out, I said, we really should have a company that is, producing content that is unique to sort of the iPad world, highly interactive ebooks and so on. So we had a company called Touch Press that did that. And one of the things that went wrong, and things did go wrong there, I can tell that story sometime. One of the principal things that went wrong was we were one of a kind. There wasn't, we had thought that there would be a whole gaggle of companies producing highly sophisticated interactive ebooks, and there would be a whole ecosystem with reviewers and distributors and this and that and the other. A bit like how over time they've become, all kinds of elaborate mechanisms for podcasts and things like that, that there would be a mechanism, a sort of a track, a channel for highly interactive ebooks. It never developed. And we were kind of we were sort of the leading company in a market of one or two. And that's a type of market where there can be as many entrants as you imagine. It's not a market where, there's never going to be just sort of one publishing company for books, for example. It's just not the nature of that because of the way that the economics of that work. And so, but that was a case where I wish there had been more entrants in that market, because the cost of doing things, if you're the only entrant, there's no ecosystem. If you're like promoting it to people, it's like you have to build your whole, the whole stack of promotion mechanisms. Whereas if there's an ecosystem and there's, app reviews and this, that, and the other that work on that area, you don't have to build that. So, sometimes it's better to be the one company and say, we are the one and only company that does this, and we've got this sort of highly defensible, valuable tower that we're building. And sometimes being the one company in this barren landscape, it's like then you have to build everything for yourself, and that's not a good situation to be in. And so I would say that there's no one right answer, and it's sometimes hard to figure out. Sometimes it's like there's going to be a lot of flowers growing in this field, and then it's like, oh, there's so many flowers that it's going to cut off my sunlight and I'm not going to be able to get anywhere. Or are there so few flowers that nobody's going to know when they see this one flower growing in the middle of the field? It's like, oh, what is that thing? We don't understand what that is. It must be an alien species type thing. And it's so, I think you have to kind of, it's tricky to see between those things. There's a question here, and this will be the last one I'm going to address right now, about computational contracts. And no, actually, we've had a group that continues to work on computational contracts, Wolfram Blockchain Labs. What's happened with computational contracts is we've been slowly building out our sort of Wolfram language stack. We've also been building out the autonomous execution side of computational contracts. It's really a market-driven thing, because there's the smart contract idea very tied into cryptocurrencies and blockchains, and there's the more general computational contract idea. And I would say that what's happened there is a lot of, I would say companies and countries and so on have been interested in computational contracts. We've interacted with lots of these places. I would say we've done modest projects with them. It hasn't yet sort of a major sort of direction for business, but I think it's a super interesting thing. And I think that it's important for the future. It's something where, it's going to be a huge industry one day. And, I figured out a certain amount about what the contours of that industry are going to look like, how the legal industry plugs into it, how lawyers start writing code, and how there's reusability of pieces of code, and how that works with the whole sort of IP of that kind of thing, how you start having different kinds of autonomous execution providers for computational contracts, how you have validation of the incoming data for computational contracts. There's a whole bunch of components of the business that have to be built there. And I think it's so anyway, that's a there's lots of activity there, although I think the world isn't completely ready for it yet. So more to be seen in the future. And I'm being reminded that I'm 15 minutes late for something that is I'm supposed to do for my day job. So I have to sign off here. Thanks for joining us. And we'll be doing, let's see, this time next week will be a history of science and technology. And then the following week will be another iteration of this live stream.